Esteemers, it's Natalie Ellis here with Esteem Counseling and Consulting Services, and welcome to Ask the Therapist with Natalie. So, today is October 21st. Man, the year is just moving along. Although it's been a rough year, it's been a long and short year all at the same time, but it's just moving along. And so, yeah, so this month is National Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and I wanted to talk a little bit about domestic violence. Okay, but I wanted to broaden the conversation to more about abusive relationships. So I wanted to broaden it to not just domestic, to abusive relationships, because when people think of domestic violence, they often only think of intimate relationships. But domestic violence can happen in families, between parents and parent-child. It can happen with siblings. It can happen amongst friendships, right? So abusive relationships can take place in many different forms. But when we think of, again, domestic violence, we often think of spousal or relational, intimate relationships. Because the definition of domestic, first of all, means relating to the running of a home or family relations. So there's that. Domestic means family relations. And violence means, based on Webster, behavior involving physical force intended to hurt, damage, or kill someone or something. Right? So when we just take those two simple definitions of domestic and violence, it seems as if domestic is primarily just related to family stuff, and violence is related to somebody who's trying to physically hurt you, damage, or kill you, right? And there's definitely signs of domestic violence, but those become very, very clear, right? But before we even get to that, right, there's a lot of other signs. There's a lot of other things to be mindful of and to be aware of that are also abusive. And so I just wanted to kind of talk about that also on that scale. Just abusive relationships. And again, as I said, abusive relationships is not just amongst partners or intimate partners, but it's parent-child. Could be between parent and children. Could be amongst siblings. It could be with friends, right? So abuse takes place in many different ways and can appear in a lot of different relationships. And so we want to make sure we are aware of all of that, because no matter what, none of it is okay, right? To be and to subject yourself in any kind of abusive relationship is not okay, whether it's with your husband, whether it's with a spouse, with his partner, whether it's mom, dad, siblings, brother, friends. It's not okay to continue to subject ourselves to that, right? And so it doesn't have to be to a point of violence. And so I just want to make sure that you guys understand that. Right, so we're going to talk about not just domestic violence, but also on a bigger scale, just abusive relationships amongst family, parents, siblings, friendships, and all of that. All right, so what are some signs to just be mindful of? And again, when we think of domestic violence, we think of the big things in terms of just physical abuse, right? The hitting, the punching. And again, that becomes very clear. By the time things get to that point, it's clear, because we know that's not okay. And we know it doesn't feel good, right? The hitting, the punching, choking, using weapons to inflict pain, threatening to harm and threatening to hurt. And even with physical abuse, controlling what you eat when you sleep. Those could be under physical abuse. Forcing you to do work against your will. Forcing you to use drugs and alcohol. Right? Because again, with physical abuse, when it comes to about harm, right? Anything that may create harm to the body, the physical body, can be considered physical abuse, right? And so, yeah, forcing you to use drugs and alcohol, and stopping you from getting any type of medical treatment and seeking help. Okay? And so that could be considered physical abuse in regards to abusive. And again, for some of you joining in, I want to talk about abuse in a broader scale, not just amongst partners, intimate partners, but also in relationships, parent-child relationships, sibling relationships, friendships, because some of this stuff could happen amongst parent-child relationships, right? So it's abuse child abuse is also a common thing that occurs, right? And so we want to make sure we bring all that and put all that into perspective as well. So abuse in any kind of form, in any kind of relationship, isn't okay, and we want to be mindful and aware of that. So the other piece I wanted to also share as I go through all these different signs is what I find also with a lot of my clients who find themselves in abusive adult relationships, right? Many times some of that have also started in their childhood, right? And so many times there's been instances in their upbringing where an adult in their lives, other people in their lives, caretakers, have shown signs of abuse towards them, whether it's an emotional abuse, and we'll go through that, right? Because there's all forms of abuse that I want to make sure you're aware. So when a child has experienced some of those things in their early life, right, stuff becomes common. So things we consider our signs are just the norm, right? They're not signs anymore, which is why bringing awareness to these things is so important, right? Because what's common to me, because this is just what my life is, oh, this is actually a thing. This is actually something to pay attention to. This is actually something that's not healthy or good for me, right? Whereas I may not have thought that because that's just been what I've been used to for such a long time. And so we want to make sure we continue to bring awareness to situations like that. And again, when I talk about abusive relationships, I'm talking about all relationships between spousal, intimate partners, friendships, parent-child relationships, siblings, all of that. Okay, and so we talked about, again, the most obvious signs, physical abuse, right? And everybody kind of knows that's wrong. That's not okay, and that doesn't feel good, so we notice that first, physical abuse. And there's also signs of sexual abuse, again, amongst partners where, although we're married, when people are forcing themselves on you, although we're in a relationship, when somebody's forcing themselves on you to perform sexual acts, again, it doesn't feel good, and it's not okay, right? Putting their will on you when you're saying no, when you're saying that's not something you want, okay? So somebody mentioned the hardest part is when you finally come to the realization that the relationship is abusive. Oh yeah, surely, right? So in anything, because again, we go into things with the intention that the goodness, right? And so when we're in that situation and this is what we're craving for and we're wanting, and to come to the realization, it's not that, right? And having to face that and having to work through that, yeah, it's definitely devastating. And that requires people to go through their own mourning, right? So there's a grief that occurs. There's losses that occurs, and we have to definitely work through that. So it is hard. But to get to that realization and to acknowledge it, that's half the battle. That is half the battle. And then we could do the work towards healing from there. Okay? So definitely. So yeah, some signs of sexual abuse. Demanding sex when you're not willing or able. Harming you during sex by choking, holding, or striking. Again, especially when this is not the agreement, right? In any relationships, there's expectations, there's agreement, and there's conversations that occur. And so when things are being done and you didn't agree to, that's not okay, right? Forcing you to watch porn, insulting you in sexual ways. And so again, sexual abuse within that spousal relationships or intimate relationship, but also sexual abuse occurs within family situations too, right? Parent-child, so being aware of all those type of signs of abuse. And then we have psychological abuse. So threatening to hurt you, your loved ones, those are ways that's psychological abuse. Controlling the time you spend with others or monitoring where you go, those are forms of psychological abuse. Controlling what you wear, that's a sign, right? So again, when I talk about relationships, I don't want you to just stay stuck on just spousal relationships. So again, relationships with friendships, parent-child relationships. So again, as I have a lot of situations when you have a parent who is abusive, but when the child is small, some of that may not appear like it, right? But then as the child become an older teenager, now has become an adult, some of those same behaviors continue to manifest. Well, yeah, then there's a form of abuse when parents are controlling certain things that the child is wearing, is doing, and so they're being mindful of that too. Okay, so someone says, do people stay within the abusive relationship because the fear of homeless or finances? Surely. And again, we'll talk about financial abuse, right? So yeah, people stay into these situations because of fear, right? I think finance more than anything. And somebody just brought that up. Yeah, financial situations. So there's financial abuse too, where the person is using that as a way to kind of keep you in that relationship, right? And so, seeds are planted, of course, by the other individual, and then we continue to take that on, right? So then we add on this additional fear of being homeless, because we do know there's resources out there, right? There's resources, there's things out there. But then when we again, our mindset and the thinking that we get stuck on the fear of certain things, then it holds us and keeps us, I don't want to say trapped, but it keeps us holding on longer, right? But yes, financial abuse is something that people use to keep people in abusive relationships, not on both ends, right? I remember having this is a parent-child, this is an adult person who the parent was using financial abuse as a way to kind of keep the person under check. And again, she thought that was okay. They're just helping me. But then as she's shown the history, it was much more than that. And so again, being mindful of psychological abuse. So damaging or stealing your belongings, blaming you for the abuse, saying that you deserve what happens, or that you're instigating. So when you're being blamed for whatever mood they're in, yeah, that's a form of abuse, because we're not in control of how other people feel. We're just not. Okay? Like shame. How did I let this get this far? Yes. Shame also kind of keeps people in things. And going back to somebody mentioning realizing this, right? Sometimes we don't want to it becomes hard to get to that space because it comes with a lot of other emotions, right? It comes with shame, right? In realizing and recognizing this is what it's been, now we have to also deal with all the feelings as to, well, why didn't I see this? Why did I stay? Right? So that is something that does occur. Okay, and then gaslighting is something. I know that word has gotten a lot of buzz. A lot of my clients have mentioned that word to me. So gaslighting, saying things to make you question your perception of reality, right? And so when someone is making you question what's going on, as if your feelings, your thoughts, your actions isn't what it is, then it is something to, again, be mindful of as well. It's heartbreaking, even, for sure. It is hard, right? The realization of everything. Because again, when we go into relationships with people, and even relationships we have with families, with friends, right? When we come to that realization, oh man, the way that this relationship has been abusive towards me, yeah, it is devastating, right? Because that's not what we hoped with that person. And so now, how do we move on? How do we mourn this relationship, how it was, and then how do we want to continue, and how do we recreate that, if that is something to do with boundaries, right? Because that's going to be an important thing here, about boundaries, emotional boundaries, physical boundaries, and all, right? Another signs is emotional abuse. So when the individual is attacking your sense of worth, your sense of self-worth, insulting you, calling you names, criticizing you, humiliating you, acting jealous or possessive, withholding affection. I hear that happen, a lot. Those are things, right? When we're mad and then the person stops talking for days, right? It's one thing, again, to say, hey, you know what, I'm really upset right now. We're going to create a break. Let me calm down, and then we'll come back. But no conversations, right? And that leaves the other person wondering and blaming themselves and questioning what's going on. And so, and them specifically doing withholding of affection as a way to punish you, right? Cheating on you intentionally, that's a form of emotional abuse, and lying to you. And so these are more so connected to the cheating and, well, the cheating more so than anything is connected to spousal or intimate relationships, right? But again, when we have family members that lie as a way to kind of control situations, right? So being aware of that. Let's see. Somebody brought up financial abuse, right? So signs of financial abuse: preventing you from access to bank accounts with your money, only permitting you to spend from an allowance, monitoring how you spend and use your money, stealing your money or using your savings without your permission, refusing to contribute to shared expenses and things like that. And so when you have particular, I'm dealing with a client in this situation where she's with a partner, and he's the sole breadwinner. And so there's different things to just, again, for her to be mindful of, right? Because again, because someone is acting in a way that appear abusive doesn't mean that they're an abuser too, right? Because we all have our flaws, we all have our thing, and we all got stuff we're dealing with and working through, right? And so there's times I could yell at someone and it's not okay, it doesn't feel good, but doesn't necessarily mean that I'm an abuser, right? So we have to be mindful of these things. But again, being aware of people's behaviors and being mindful of people's patterns, because we're looking at patterns of behavior. And when patterns or behavior is saying this, it's abuse. It's saying this, it's creating these type of abusive situations, then that is something we need to pay attention to, right? How does people who have abusive relationships or past experiences with abuse, how do you let go and try to start fresh, but also see triggers with the new person and still separate the two? Well, the first thing I would say is definitely seek counseling, seek professional help, right? Because again, if there are other layers of abuse that's there, that may need to be worked through, right? Because again, oftentimes when we're dealing with trauma, the lens we're looking through is through that lens, right? And so when we're looking through a lens of somebody who's traumatized, then we're often triggered. And the trigger, yes, is very much real, but it may not be accurate, right? It may not be an accurate thing. And so we have to do our work to kind of figure those things out, and work through those things. But it is okay. It is possible to let go, and it is possible to start fresh, because that is the question. But in order to do that, you may have to do the work, to work through your own past, right? And learning how to create boundaries, learning how to create clear boundaries. One of the things too, because oftentimes from what I've seen, in particular in my work, people that tend to be in adult relationships that are abusive, whether it's with friends, whether it's with partners, whether it's continues to be in their families, is these are things that's been happening since they were young, right? And so boundaries have been blurred, boundaries have been broken for a very long time, right? And a lot of these individuals don't really have clear boundaries, right? And so anything kind of goes when we don't have clear boundaries. People could treat us and do things to us, and we're not really sure. We're just like, oh, that's just what they do, right? And so learning really how to set boundaries for ourselves, learning to figure out what is okay and is not okay, right? And starting from there and creating that boundary. But sometimes to get to that space again, we may need to do the internal work and therapy to get there. All right. And this is particularly for couples too, when reproductive coercion, that's a part of domestic violence, refusing to use condom. That's something I just heard today. One of my clients was talking about potentially being in a relationship and the person got them pregnant intentionally, on purpose, right? And so again, when this is not something we agreed to, and this is not, and we agreed to something else because that wasn't the initial agreement, yeah, there is a form of abuse there, right? And we have to notice that, and we have to pay attention to it. So when somebody's refusing to let you use birth control, so again, this is more for the women, sabotaging birth control efforts, forcing you to be pregnant, or forcing you to have abortions and all those things. So that's reproductive coercion, and that could be abusive in ways, right? And the forcing for the abortion, I've had situation with adult clients where when they were younger and their mothers have forced them to get an abortion, and this is something that they're still struggling with years and years later. And so, again, looking at signs of abuse can be in all kinds of relationships, and just again be mindful and aware of that. Now with the age of the internet and the cyber age and digital age and all that, there's digital abuse as well. Sending you insulting or threatening messages over text, email, or social media. I have a client that's going through that right now. The person keeps changing their number and keeps changing apps, because I guess in the app they could change the number, and they keep changing the number through the app to keep in touch with the person. And, she's going to have to file a restraining order because she has clearly said, hey, please don't contact me. Hey, please don't contact me. And if they continue to do that, doesn't matter what the reason is, and that's a violation, right? That's abuse, right? Because you're violating someone else's expectations, somebody else's, what somebody else needs. Okay. Let's see, with digital, using social media sites like Facebook to track what the person is doing, demanding you to send sexually explicit photos. And again, a lot of this stuff happens with young kids, right? Because I work a lot with young girls, and exchange of photos happen. I have one particular young lady, that's something we talk a lot about with the boys that she's dealing with, in terms of they're forcing, and she says it's like they just want me to really send them this stuff, my nude photos, and they won't talk to me if I don't send it to them. And again, helping her recognize, yeah, that's not okay, right? Forcing you to do something you don't want to do can become abusive, right? Is not okay, because that's a violation of your boundary. So something to be aware of. There's signs of stalking. Again, that's abuse, and falls under domestic violence, where they're following you, they're spying on you, sending you unwanted messages, and all of that stuff. So these are all the different things. Lots of signs related to, again, the overall topic of domestic violence, but also then abusive relationships. And things we need to be aware of. And again, when I talk about abusive relationships, not just amongst partners, but within families, parent-child relationships, sibling relationships. I have a few clients who, again, have gotten beat up by siblings, not just typical sibling rivalry. And again, being able to identify the difference, right? Sibling rivalry and someone beating up on you to hurt you intentionally over and over. Yeah, that's not okay. Right? And being able to put words to that and say that. Right? Because again, those are things that's often dismissed. Okay, that helps a lot. Looking through trauma lenses was so helpful. I need to work on that. Yes. Yeah. What are some safety tips if I am experiencing abuse? Okay. If you think you are being abused, seek help. Again, it's important to talk, not keep secrets. Now, again, this is domestic violence, physical abuse, sexual abuse, all this family stuff, right? Domestic stuff is full of secrecy, right? Which is how some of this stuff kind of continues in a lot of ways, right? Because we don't talk about the stuff that goes on in the house, right? But again, when we don't talk about these things, the things manifest, it continues, and then here we are, cycles, and then we get into generational cycles, and things continue on. So seeking help and talking is recommended. Get help. Consider sharing your concern with trusted friend, family member, or neighbor, right? Developing escape strategies is something else that to consider. Again, there's lots of services out there. So there's the 1-800 number, and I'll provide that as well. So there's ways for people to seek help. But oftentimes when people are realizing that they're in an abusive situation, like somebody says, it's so devastating, right? It's devastating, and lots of shame attached to that people just don't want to tell anybody, just want to hide, right? And just deal with it. And it just perpetuates and gets worse. And so definitely when you're feeling that, it's understandable. It's normal to feel that. I validate that, recognize that, acknowledge that, and get help. And still seek help. Call those numbers. Okay? And definitely talk to a trained professional. Seek counseling. Right? And again, the same thing. If you have friends, if you know people that may be in those situations and you're worried about them, definitely stay in touch. Just today, I had another client, and again, I'm concerned a little bit about her relationship, because if she's too isolated, it could become that, right? But she is keeping in contact with family. She's doing things, and so, and sounds like he's doing some work as well. But again, these are things we have to be mindful of and be aware of. So, staying in contact with the individual, because again, domestic violence and sometimes abuse in different ways forces people to feel isolated because they feel different. They feel like something's wrong, or they don't want people to kind of know what's going on. And so again, oftentimes we have all these things happening to us. We think other people might know, so we just want to not deal and stay away from people. And when that happens, and when you know people that may be going through that and they've kind of haven't called, then yeah, it's important that we reach out. It's important that we stay connected to them and we support them, and we help them work through whatever it is that they're going through. Okay. And definitely respecting their privacy, respecting how they want to move forward, because again, as we know, a lot of domestic violence situations do end in death as well, right? And so you want to make sure that, and there's a lot of things we're not privy to in those relationships, and so how people want to get out of that, men or women, how they want to get out of that, they have to figure out, because they know who that person, who they're dealing with, because there's safety concerns as well, which is why a lot of not a lot, all domestic violence shelters, all those places are confidential, right? Because oftentimes the perpetrator tries to find these women for, to get them back or to continue to harm them, or those things. So those are things to be mindful of. Okay. So the 1-800 number, the hotline, the National Domestic Violence Hotline, is 1-800-799-7733. Uh-oh, let me see. Make sure my glasses is right, because I have bifocals now. 1-800-799, I think it's 7233, and the number's too small. I should have made it longer, bigger. So 1-800-799-SAFE. So it should be SAFE. 7233 is SAFE. 1-800-799-SAFE. That's the number to the National Domestic Violence Hotline. Right? And how I got some of this information, there's an organization called Live Your Dream. They have a lot of resources there. And there's also the Unwoman, another organization called unwomen.org. And they have a lot of resources there as well. And so, yes, 1-800-799-SAFE. That's it. Right? And so that is it. I'm going to kind of write this up when I put it into the feed and put it in the Instagram story, I guess, or Instagram live. So hopefully this was helpful. And so again, for any of you out there who is struggling with any kind of relationship that they see as abusive, definitely seek help, definitely seek support. There is help out there, there is support out there, and we can work towards healing. Okay, thank you so much, and I'll talk to you guys next time.